Hi, this is Larry Hatch. I'm a horticultural taxonomist and co-founder of cultivar.org. Today's episode is part one of the top variegated deciduous trees. And as you might guess from having more than one part, there's a lot to talk about. This episode is brought to you by Cultivars of Woody Plants, the most comprehensive guide to varieties of trees, shrubs, vines, and conifers ever created. It's over 6,500 PDF pages, and you can carry it with you on your phone, your tablet, your laptop, any portable device that reads PDF files. Got thousands and thousands of high-resolution digital pictures that I've collected and rescanned since 40 years ago, and it's taxonomically accurate, and I hope you like it. Please visit cultivar.org if you haven't already. Without further ado, our first beautiful, stunning variegated tree is my favorite of them all, Fagus sylvatica purpurea tricolor. It's not tricolor as it's sometimes sold. Tricolor is a different thing, in fact very rare, but purpurea tricolor takes kind of a purplish green leaf, adds a white margin, and because of the pigments underneath, or actually between the white marginal layers, they are pink. And in the spring, this is one of the most unbelievably beautiful trees. If you've ever seen one backlit by the morning sun, holy heck, it's almost like somebody painted it with candy. It's just so beautiful. Any garden of any size, let's say more than an acre, should have one of these where they'll do well. Now, the European beeches don't do well in hot, humid climates like the South, but where you can grow it, wow, there's no prettier tree anywhere. There's a large number of variegated beeches. Most of them are kind of slow and scarcely variegated, not that impressive really, but there's one that's a newer one that's an exception to that. It's called Franken, Franken, and I got a picture of it here. It's not only highly variegated and bright, that white is pristine and just pops out in those white, silver, cream, gray shades, and it's a vigorous plant. Unlike some of the older variegated stuff, it's extremely bright and vigorous. And by the way, the term for a variegated plant is a variegate, G-A-T-E, if you want to just throw that in there. And by the way, variegated plants, by definition, are those that lack chlorophyll in certain portions and have what we call a chimera, usually of pink, white, or yellow, various combinations. And they have to lack chlorophyll in a certain part of the leaf or stem structure. Stem structure in the case of a plant that's generally leafless or has a phylloclad. A plant that's multicolored is one that has many colors, but not necessarily a chimera lacking chlorophyll. So if you take something like a begonia, most begonias really aren't variegated, they're multicolored. Coleus is a weird thing, because some coleus are variegated, and they have sections that lack chlorophyll, such as a big creamy center or creamy margins, and they're obviously multicolored in most cases. So some coleus are multicolored, some are variegated and multicolored. Just to get our terms straight. Anyway, our third plant today is a fairly new one, came out just a couple years ago, and it's one of the most beautiful tricolored trees in existence. It was developed as a hybrid by Dr. Tom Rainey of North Carolina State University out at the Mountains Research Center in western North Carolina. And what he did basically was take a variegated redbud, Cercis canadensis, and he crossed it with a purple form. So when you cross the green and white with the purple, the new foliage is going to have some of that pigment in the hybrid, and it comes out this beautiful tricolor, which is known as Carolina Sweetheart, which is kind of appropriate because it's a pink heart shape. And so Cercis canadensis Carolina Sweetheart is a tree to be reckoned with. It's beautiful. It holds this color long into the summer, and anytime it's got new growth, it's going to have that color. So it's a great plant. Our next plant is a little bit of a rare one, maybe controversial, but it's one that I really think demands more attention in American gardens. It's a maple, Acer folium vicii. And it's called folium because it has a leaf like a crataegus or a hawthorn. And it's got a beautiful set of markings in a light creamy yellow. No two leaves are the same. Sometimes they're margined, but most times they're just streaked in what we call sectored, big huge sections of the leaf, a third of the leaf, a quarter of the leaf, often half the leaf, on a very dark green base. And if you look close, you can see that it usually has red petioles and red twigs for contrast. So you take that variegation with the red twigs and red petioles, especially in the early part of the spring, summer. It's a beautiful plant. It's kind of slow. It's not going to take over. So if you have a smaller garden and want a bright splash of color that almost looks like yellow flowers, good choice. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the Japanese maples because I have separate videos on those, but I do want to point out in the Acer palmatums there's what we call the Ghost series from the Buchholz people, and other people have worked with those as well. The Ghost series basically have what we call reticulated veins. They have portions of the leaf between the veins that are variegated and normally green veins. And they come in a whole host of colors, from yellows to light greens to mint greens like here, ambers, violet reds, true reds. One is almost black. I'm missing out here. It's yellows, creams, pretty much anything you can imagine. And the stuff in the Ghost series is absolutely spectacular. There's quite a few of them. There's First Ghost, Grandma's Ghost, Sister Ghost, all kinds of different ghosts. So I recommend you check those out. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about those here. And they do have a lack of pigment, even though they have a sheen, a covering of reds and yellows many times. Basically, the whole Ghost series is based on the old reticulatum group, which we believe has been grown in Japan for centuries. It's a simple mutation of having variegation between the green, finely textured veins. And as the leaf matures, that chlorophyll lacking tissue between the green veins develops its chlorophyll, so it slowly becomes an all green leaf later on, or at least mostly green. So it's what we call virescent, V-I-R-E-S-C-E-N-T, meaning becoming green. And that's true of most white-tipped plants. They have a genetic mutation that keeps the chlorophyll from developing on the normal speedy pattern, and so it develops slowly. In these reticulatum type Japanese maples, the chlorophyll develops very well, very quickly, immediately on the veins, the primary, secondary, and tertiary veins, but between them, for some reason, the chlorophyll develops and colors up very slowly in that area. So the reticulatums have been in the Western world, I believe, since the late 1800s. I'm going to say 1885. I'll have to check that. But anyway, they've been around for a very long time, over 100 years in the West, and they think several centuries in Japan. So when we had these reticulatums, they were just kind of green and white, not too boring. People like the Buchholzes and some other Japanese maple breeders, and yes, people are breeding those species, not just the one, but several. But when they could cross the reticulatum types, these vein types, with purple, red, and pink-leaved Japanese maples, they got stuff like the Ghost series. So they took the white and green of the reticulatum, added overlays of other colors, yellows, reds, pinks, violet reds, blacks, and so on, and have developed a whole series of beautiful plants, which I'm calling the Ghost series. It is really a collection of cultivars now, not just from one breeder, but from many. Our next plant is going to be controversial, and I'll probably get some grief for this. It is one of the most beautiful variegated trees there is. It's Acer platanoides Drummondii, and it's a Norway maple, which is, yes, a weed tree, and it is invasive because it does produce seeds. The variegated form does produce variegated samaras, by the way. But in my experience and from what I've been able to read, it is itself not fruitful enough to be considered an invasive weed tree. What I like about some variegated plants is when you have a variegated form of a weed tree, it's going to be hard to kill. It's going to grow fast. It's going to just take over. And what its variegation qualities are, you're going to get a lot of it in a lot of space real quickly. The Drummondii, you can take it from a tree at a nursery, or even a small graft, let's say 3 feet high, and get a beautiful shade tree within a few years. Really, by 10 years, it's spectacular, like this tree here. It does cast a heavy shade, so you probably can't grow a lot of grass under it, but you can grow other ground covers under it. Dare I say ivy? Yes, I will say it. Yes, you can grow heterohelix under a Acer platanoides Drummondii. I said it. In the right space, nothing's going to go wrong. Yeah, don't worry about it. Our next plant is a pretty rare one, but some of you know it. It's a variegated form of Zelkova. It's a Zelkova serrata Goshiki, but it's usually sold as Variegata. It's an interesting plant because the creamy white margins are not really uniform. It's actually a collection of heavy fused spots on the margin, and that's something we call marginomaculata, meaning a margin made of spots. And that type of variegation does occur in quite a few plant genera where it's not an even, ring-like chimera on the edge. It's just a collection of fused spots, and that in itself is a very subtle, beautiful type of variegation. It has all the qualities of a regular Zelkova, and in my experience, it's not really that much slower. It's pretty vigorous. And if you look at the bark here very carefully, instead of the usual kind of gray striations and markings on the bark, this particular cultivar tends to have more of a tannish or light brown and beige bark. Also, as the tree matures, nicely mottled. So I think it's a tree attractor both for the bark and for the interesting foliage. Why not? I want to say something about it. The name Goshiki traces to Barry Yinger. Its introduction from Japan in 1978, where it was grown under the name of Goshiki. Barry Yinger introduced it through, I believe it was Brookside Gardens in Maryland. And, Barry is the king of variegated plant and rare plant introducers, discoverers, explorers from Asia in the last half century. And he's brought us literally hundreds of beautiful Asian plants. So his introduction, Goshiki, and he published that in the Arnoldia, was from 1978. Well, it turns out was additional research that the same clone, and we believe it is the same clone, or a very similar one, was introduced by the United States Department of Agriculture in 1959. I'm 60 years old. That's the year I was born in. And one day I had the privilege of being at the National Arboretum, and previous to him becoming director of that fine institution, Dr. Richard Olson was showing me through the Arboretum's nursery of old plants, and sure enough, there was this beautiful margin-immaculated type variegated Zelkova. I do have to admit the bark was not as tan as this one. It was kind of a normal gray. So there's a possibility there's more than one clone if that bark characteristic holds up. But the USDA had imported this variegated form from Japan in 1959. And I have pictures of that tree in cultivars of woody plants if you care to be interested in that. It's a great tree, all the qualities of that species. And let's move on. The next one is a very interesting plant. It's Betula nigra, Shiloh Splash. It's a highly, highly variegated, very rich chimera of the river birch. And it's a selection from what must be some very good stock, because that little green Christmas tree in the center of the leaf, and look closely at that, is very dark. Not all the species material has a dark leaf base. This does, and it has a beautiful, just creamy, almost light buttery yellow color. And look at that chimera. It's more attractive in the spring and early summer than the rest of the year, but it's a great plant. And as you know, Betula nigra is a plant that takes lots of heat, lots of humidity, being that it's from the southeastern United States primarily. And so it's a variegated tree, proper tree, small tree though, that is extremely resistant to heat and humidity and lots of other abuse, really. So here's a tough plant if you really need one. Our next tree is another one that's not widely seen. It's a version of the Chinese chestnut, or Japanese chestnut rather, Castanea mellissima, and it's called Aria variegata. We think the American stock may be different than the European stock, but it appears to match up to the European Aria variegata, and it's got a beautiful, irregular, light to medium, almost butter yellow margin against that highly textured, highly veined leaf of the chestnut. It's a very beautiful plant. You will see it in some collections, but it remains quite rare, and it does seem to be reasonably vigorous. So anywhere you can grow a nice chestnut tree, Castanea mellissima, consider putting one of these in. I have no idea whether it produces nuts or not, but it probably does. But it's a lovely tree on its own, and I've seen it at a couple of places, like the Ralston Arboretum and Juniper Level Botanic Garden in Raleigh, and I've seen it in a few other cities too. Just can't think of them at the time. Let's move on here. I don't want this video to be like forever long. Our next plant is Melia azedarach Jade snowflake, and the Melia azedarach, as you may know, it's got lots of different names. But if you're somebody who's ever worked with soap or candles or anything fragrant, there's a popular scent called Persian lilac. Well, Persian lilac doesn't come from Lilac syringa as we know them. It actually comes from Melia, the species to which this sport belongs. And when you harvest those flowers in small beginning seed heads, you get this amazing fragrance that's just wow, and it's popularly used in soaps. But anyway, this is a very bright variegated mutation. It's both I would call it mottled and sectored, and it's pretty white at its whitemost, and it's therefore very hard to photograph because your camera's doing a million things with all these reflective and non-reflective bits at the same time. It's got a very glossy dark green base color, and it's got overlays of anything from bright white to creamy white to silver to shades of gray to kind of a limeish green. But it's highly variegated, highly vigorous like the species. It was found by Dr. J.C. Ralston many years ago. And here's another example of a durable weed tree that is beautiful. And this is not going to be for everybody, but it like the Drummond maple, it's going to be tough and make a beautiful plant in a short amount of time. Our last plant of this part one is another redbud, and it's probably not the one you think. It's Cercis canadensis alley cat. Well, there are actually 3 older variegated redbuds out there, but the problem is that a lot of them burn in the sun, even the northern sun, and a lot of them fade to green. Again, that virescent thing, the white bit becoming green later on, very quickly. And so those 3 cultivars, the old ones, they're beautiful for, I don't know, a week, a month, a couple of weeks a month, a couple of weeks to a month, I should say. But Alley Cat is an improved selection. It holds its variegated color almost all summer. And in fact, this plant was taken in the heat and humidity of the Ralston Arboretum in August. You know, those 100-degree, 99% humidity days. And look at this bright color. Okay, if you look in the back of the canopy, yeah, the leaves do turn greener, but they happen at a much slower rate, and it also burns less. It'll burn in hot sun, but it burns less than the other material, the older material, and it retains that variegation well into the fall. I would say September would be its limit. And as long as you can keep the tree vigorous with these new shoots, you'll have color both spring and summer. So let's end it there, and I'm ready to begin part 2 very shortly. So look for that. It's not going to be released at the same time, but look for part 2 if you like this one. And again, I don't want this to be a sermon, a monologue, a diatribe. Please comment below. Tell me where you disagree. Tell me if I've missed some other plants. They may be in the next part, but give me some suggestions. And I'm open to opinions and everything. And let's make the comments here a little bit of a dialogue on the top deciduous variegated plants. Again, this is brought to you by Cultivars of Woody Plants. Please consider subscribing. It's a great value, and you'll find nothing else like it. Thank you.